Hey,
early.
everybody. Welcome to the wonderful world of Remnant Radio. Today, we're talking about the Enneagram. I got Dawson with us. It's going to be an exciting program. You guys stay tuned. You are watching the Remnant Radio, a crowd-funded show where we interview pastors, teachers, historians, and theologians from different churches and denominations. My name is Joshua Lewis, and this is my co-host, Michael Roundtree. Together, we want to help you break outside of your theological echo chambers. If you're interested in learning about history, theology, or the gifts of the Spirit, this is the show for you. Well, it's been a couple of weeks in the making. As many of you know, we tried to do a live stream, but because of technical difficulties on the Enneagram, we had to do a do-over. And today, we are all prepped and got all of our technology ironed out just right. So we've got an exciting program for you today. But before we talk about that program, I want to let you know a little bit about Remnant Radio. We are entirely crowdfunded. And if you've been blessed by this episode or other episodes we've done, we'd encourage you to support the channel. There are links in the description. You can give a one-time gift on PayPal or a recurring gift there on Patreon. So it's $5 a month. You'll get access to extra content there. Some of that extra content includes things like book clubs, live Q&As. Occasionally we have commentary on one of the videos or interviews that we've done. They're like, what did you think about that? And that's a great place where we can kind of talk about that. Additionally, on Patreon, we got a bunch of interviews at the Send. Interviews with Mike Bickle, Francis Chan, Christine Kane, Lou Engle, many, many more. And those are being uploaded early on a Patreon and will later be uploaded to YouTube later on. So if you want early access to some of those videos, go check them out. We haven't uploaded all of them yet, but we'll plan to do that here soon, here shortly. Additionally, there was a lot of research done by Dawson on this program. So if you want to dive deeper into this study, maybe some things we didn't cover in this episode just because it's only an hour long, there is a study guide on our website, theremnantradio.com. Go check out the study guides at the top. There's a whole list of study guides that are present that Dawson has done. And under that tab, you'll find Enneagram with a bunch of extra research, like 22-page documents, something like that. Without further ado, let me introduce you to the fellows. That's Dawson there in the middle. That's Michael over on the right. Before we have Dawson introduce himself, Mike, how's your week? Mike? That just sounded weird saying.
It's all good, man. It's going really well over here. Having a good time here in the OKC. Hope you guys are doing well out there. Been looking forward to this episode. And that study guide that he mentioned that Dawson put together, guys, not only is it insightful, it's also pretty funny. You see a little bit of the Dawson sense of humor coming out. So you guys definitely want to check that out. A couple of things I want you guys to know about. If you haven't checked out some of our other episodes this week, we did one on the Freemasons. It's still climbing. It's just, I guess, a couple days in. It's got about 10,000 views, but a lot of commentary on the Freemasons. That was with Ken Fish. Josh did an episode on inner healing, but looking at it from a church history perspective. That was yesterday. And then next week, we have Mark Ward coming on the show. We've done a show with him before on the King James only controversy. Mark Ward is phenomenal. He is an incredible just mind and gift to the body of Christ. And so he's going to be talking about exegetical fallacies. So what are the errors we make when we are trying to study the Bible? And then also next week, we have Dave Harvey, and he's going to be talking about eldership. So lots of stuff coming up. Make sure you hit that subscribe button. And on this episode, hit that like button and get this information out there as we talk about the Enneagram. So, Dawson, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
There you are. There you are. Guys, do not be deceived. He has a few books behind him, but he has read thousands upon thousands more than that. This is one of the most well-read people that I know. So, Dawson, it is a blessing to have you on the show. So,
I moved him from Dallas to his location now where he lives in his house. And he just asked me to come to move his books. True story. I had a minivan full of books, like bumper hanging full of books to get to his. My car gave out. We have no clue why it gave out, but it did.
I literally broke your car.
Yeah, not a truck. True story.
Yeah.
Anyway, right. Dawson, tell us about yourself. I totally interrupted Michael. It's
all good. Dawson, it's all good. I was just quiet thinking of a pun and it didn't come to me. So Nope. Go ahead. We always do that. Okay, go ahead. So tell us about yourself.
Hey, I'm Dawson Gerald, and I do research for the Remnant Radio, and I have a background in psychology and theology, and really interested in getting into this this whole Enneagram discussion. So I'm really ready for it.
Yeah, and some people have asked, like, hey, there are, experts on Enneagram. They've written this book. They're doing these conferences. A lot of the other YouTubers have had people on, and we often interview people here on Remnant Radio. But because there was just so much conflicting data on the internet of where this thing was, where it came from, and Dawson's expertise, both in ethics and psychology and those kinds of things, we thought, man, you do so much research for us anyway. You've already gotten expertise in the subject matter. So we just thought, man, we really need him to do this for us, and then invite him to come on the show and really research through it and talk about it. So that's the reason, if people are out there and like, why didn't you interview this guy or that pastor or that doctor or this guy, whatever. Well, we've got Dawson. We don't need any of that. You ever seen Avengers where it's like, we've got an army and they're like, yeah, we've got a Hulk? That's kind of like this situation that's going on right now. So,
Dawson, you're the Hulk.
You're the Hulk. That's right.
I am in green. I'm in green, so that works.
It works on so many levels. And
Does that mean
I
you're
speak highly of
right
Dawson
now?
because he's a sounding board for me when I write sermons.
No, I'm
when
always angry.
do research and all that good stuff. So Dawson, let's start this off. What is the Enneagram and how is it being used right now?
Okay, the Enneagram basically is a typology of personality that gives 9 types, and it describes someone's strengths and their sinful tendencies. That's kind of the point that a lot of people are like, that's very helpful because it's built on a motivation system. And it even has a built-in component that helps with spiritual growth, that if you follow this direction of growth, it'll basically show you a way to overcome your sin, or so some of the proponents say. It shows you a way to overcome your sin. But today, there's basically 2 ways that it's being used. One way, I like to call it the static way. It's just used as a personality test. The leader might give it to someone so that they get a gauge of, what kind of person they are, might even get a gauge of the sinful tendencies that they have. So he knows where to help them out. And the other way is what I like to call the dynamic, which is using it literally as a spiritual tool of growth. So it's often, by a lot of people who wrote books recently, talk in terms of that you have to have this to grow. Like, this is the key to spiritual growth. So that kind of has major buy-in, and it's very much a close-handed approach.
Okay.
Yeah.
So on the latter, Dawson, basically what these people are saying, at least some of the people that take this approach that you just described, would be that we actually have a greater understanding than Jesus and the Apostle Paul because we have the Enneagram. We're actually better off than them. Is that kind of what I hear you saying?
Yeah, I didn't put it down, but there's quotes that get very close to that, that make statements that are a little grandiose, but the basic gist is this uncovers those secret things about yourself that you don't know, which, okay, now that makes it exclusive because nothing else can uncover those things. And then it says, and it's the only way to free yourself from it. So it's making itself an exclusive tool
right.
by default.
But this is not everybody, not every Christian who uses the Enneagram uses it that way. But in some of the literature that you've read, which is quoted in your handout, it does seem to verge on that. Is kind of what I hear you say.
Yeah. The 3 major books that I used, which was the Sacred Enneagram, the one Getting Back to Yourself. I can't remember the exact title, but those 2 books specifically border on this kind of language, the exclusivity, especially the Sacred Enneagram.
Yeah, the title alone kind of tells you the Sacred Enneagram. Yowza. Okay, so
and that's why I wanted to make that distinction between someone who's using it in more of a static way. That would be someone who just uses it as a personality test and just kind of sees it as something that they're really not going to give full devotion to. Whereas this kind of dynamic way is you're kind of giving yourself over to it to be your guide for spiritual growth. So that's why I wanted to make that distinction there, because there are two ways that it's really being used today in that regard.
Okay, so you kind of given us a little bit of a general overview. Talk to us now about the history. Where did this thing come from? It didn't come from the Apostle Paul, right?
No, not at all. where did it come from? Okay. You're going to read in a lot of the books that it says it has ancient roots, that it's from the Desert Fathers, that it touches on Sufi mysticism, even Sumerian backgrounds. But those are all red herrings. There's no evidence to those whatsoever. Even so far as the actual author of it, Oscar Ichazo, he took some people to court in the 80s because they wrote books on the Enneagram too. And in the U.S. Court of Appeals, Ichazo was recognized as the original author of the Enneagram. So just on a legal basis, he proved in a court of law that he is the one who came up with it. So that pretty much settles the understanding of where it came from. And then if you look deeper into that, you find out that both one of his students, who's a major proponent, who is named Claudio Naranjo, he and Ichazo basically talk in an interview that they came up with the ancient origins as a way to explain, give it some mystery and give it some historical, kind of depth to it. Because when you say, hey, I invented this myself, it doesn't fly as well, especially with people who are looking for mystical, ancient wisdom. But how did they come up with it? How did Oscar Ichazo come up with it? It was highly influenced by Western mysticism and Western esoteric thinking. Particularly a guy by the name of Gergich. George Gergich, who is in the late 1800s, major esoteric philosopher, thinker, however you want to call it. I particularly don't like to call him a philosopher because I don't think it kind of puts philosophers in a bad light.
It's generous to call the guy a philosopher, is what you're saying.
Oh my gosh, yes, very generous. So he basically has a lot of teachings that are very similar to Gergich. I actually compared. I got a copy of a book written in 1977 called Transpersonal Psychology, and I cross-referenced that chapter on Ichazo with the Cambridge Handbook of Western Mysticism, which has a chapter on Gergich, and the teachings line up almost one-to-one. So he definitely pulled a lot from that guy in terms of the content and how he understood the human change happening and everything else. But at its root, he claims that he had an angelic encounter with an angel called Megatron, as in this Decepticons.
Wait.
And
I'm sorry, dude. Michael is such a better angel name. I'm just going to say.
Or Hulk. Is. I mean, literally anything could have been better than Megatron. Like the bad guy? Not even Optimus Prime.
It's an unfortunate name. Although it does have roots in Kabbalah. Let me give it some historical girth. It does have roots in Kabbalah, and the idea of Megatron as the presence of God is in the esoteric mystical background. But either way, come on. If that doesn't make for a providential funny joke, I don't know what does. But so Ichazo says he has this encounter, and he is given these 100 different Enneagrams with different things on the types, and he then sits down and puts them together with the teachings that he come up with, and he came up with his form of the Enneagram that he uses to help people grow, because he was a part of what is known as the human potential movement, which is this idea that through mystical practices you can unlock the full potential of humans and go super saint, basically, and so it's kind of got that idea in it, and he's coming at it from that perspective. So he's teaching on this, and Naranjo comes in and begins to learn from him, and Naranjo is trained in psychology. So Naranjo takes what he learns from him, goes back, and Naranjo claims that between his training and his own observations, he writes out the personality types, the 9 personality types, that he writes them out. and as well also gain some insight through automatic writing. Now, both of those claims, angelic visitation, automatic writing, they're pretty out there, but except for this group of people, those are almost like claims to authority. So I kind of waver on whether or not I'm just going to blindly go, oh, okay, yeah, that's what happened. Because in those groups, that kind of thing is a way you kind of get a ooh and a ah, because they're saying, see, I tapped into something that no one else has tapped into yet. I have greater potential. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. So is this, it seems as if you're saying that he's got like a sociological background where he's like looking at this kind of, this guy who has very generous to call him a philosopher, by any stretch of the imagination. So he's pulling from this guy's thinking, his thoughts, his philosophy. But I've also heard that this is like automatic writing, drug induced, some kind of like you said, there was this angel, that Metatron. People in the comment section was like, it's not Megatron, it's Metatron. But listen, mega is more fun to say. Okay, so we have it correct in the notes. To be fair, we know the name.
Dawson, to be fair, your notes say Metatron. So which is it actually, Meta or Mega?
It's Meta.
Meta. It's Meta. It's Metatron.
Okay, but we really want to say Mega. Can we?
Yeah.
It's angels in disguise. Come on, guys. Yeah. Come on.
So what was your question though, Josh?
No. Oh yeah. So my question was, is it a philosophical system that tries to make sense of who we are, sociological system that's trying to make sense of who we are and how we fit into the world? Or is this really a kind of automatic writing, demonically inspired? I mean, because those two things seem to be contrarian, automatic writing and dictation from some kind of, spiritual being. So I don't quite understand it. So maybe fill me in on it.
Well, here's the thing. We're taking Naranjo on his word that he had the automatic writing. And there's an interview where he says that happened. So you have to take him at his word that that's what happened. I tend to not, given the background of those people, which is those kind of things are a good way of having some authority behind what you're trying. Like, I tapped into something that you didn't tap into. I have more potential than you have because I had this automatic writing experience, and here's what I came out from it. And he would say that that's the personality types came from that. The same way with Ichazo. It's like he's claiming that he had these experiences. And even if he had an experience and he interpreted it as an angelic experience, we'll never know whether or not those things are true. So sometimes it's just best to say, okay, this is his testimony, and you can either take it for what it is or take it with a grain of salt. And I prefer to just take it with a grain of salt.
I mean, either way, you've got
either way, it's weird.
Demonically inspired or lying about being demonically inspired as a source of authority. Either way, it's not really a guy I want to listen to on the subject.
Yeah. And Dawson, you use the word Kabbalah, so Jewish mysticism. How is this tied to Kabbalah in some way? Because we got angels talking, we have dictation, we have drug use, and we have Kabbalah. Like, how does this all come together?
Okay, yeah, the talking about Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, which is Jewish mysticism, that's where you get the name Megatron, and there's some examples of a nine pointed star that people connect with the Enneagram, but those are all tangential. Okay, so even the stuff about the Kabbalah, that was nothing more than that's where you get that whole understanding of Megatron as an angel. So that's kind of the connection there. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I guess it's probably time for us to just describe those 9 points, those 9 different.
Let's do that.
Yeah. Let's talk about what are these personality types? Because we can ask the question, okay, is it demonic? And it seems as if the origins of this thing are demonic. Maybe describe to us what this is. And then if it's still demonic, we'll kind of go in that direction, because we look at things like, astrology, right? And then now we have astronomy. We've kind of removed the magic from it and said, okay, there's some actual science here. we could ask the question, and we will ask the question and get answers to some of that on now we know what the origins are, but has it evolved? Has it been baptized into a real psychology? Has it been baptized into kind of a Christian worldview in a way that can kind of redeem this thing? That will also be a question that we'll be asking and answering in this interview. So describe those 9 points for us so that we can have an understanding of what it is.
Okay, just generally speaking, the 9 types are the perfectionist or reformer. They're used interchangeably. The second type is the helper, the achiever, the individualist, the investigator, the loyalist, the enthusiast, the challenger, and the peacemaker. As you can see, these are not very technical language, which is part of the appeal for the Enneagram, and why people like it is they feel like they have an instant kind of intuitive understanding of what these terms are already by just the statements. But like, for example, the perfectionist is a principled, conscientious, organized, responsible, committed, concerned with improving himself and others, moral, a desire to be perfect in themselves and to make their surroundings perfect. Their basic fear is to be bad or corrupt. Their basic desire is to be good or have integrity. And just understand that from a psychological standpoint, that is way too general of a description for just type 1. Okay. And when you go through each one of the types, you get that same sense. You could even have a pastor be like, hey, give me 9 types of people. And he would probably hit on a few of these, just because anyone who has any general understanding of human nature can come up with a lot of this stuff. And that's not a good thing in terms of if you're going to have something that's a true personality test that has some scientific validation to it, because it's not distinguishing between people. And on top of that, it's extremely way too moral in terms of the categories. And I could go on for days on that because it's...
Now, when you say it's too broad, you mean like it's really applicable to anyone? Like if I'm talking to Michael and I'm like, hey, Michael, are you a moral person? Like, do you try to do what's right? And do you try to every category in some sense can apply to every person, so that it's so generic that it's hard. Like if I ask 6 questions a certain way, and then I ask the 6 questions in a different way, that the same person taking that test could actually come out into 2 different categories based off of the way that I ask the questions or the ones that they most affirm with at the time. Like when you say general, what are you talking about?
Yeah, that's the gist of being general, is that if one category for understanding how personality tests are valid is if a person can take that test and get the same answer, the same description for themselves almost every time. So if someone takes the test and there's a consistent change, from week to week, they are a perfectionist or a helper. That's a sign that the test isn't really that good. And first and foremost, now with the Enneagram, the first personality test of the Enneagram, because this is a typology, the first personality test was in 89 or so, that a guy came up with one. Now we have dozens of them all over the place. But a lot of the practitioners in the Enneagram would say, oh, you need someone like myself who's trained to kind of observe you and tell you what you are, which is, again, it doesn't help things. It's just bad science, man. I don't know how to say it any other way.
Well, on that, and I do want to keep kind of pressing into the spiritual side and maybe how some groups like the Roman Catholics view this. But before that, I don't want to depart from the science yet. And I want to ask the question because there is a proliferation of personality tests, as you mentioned. You've got Myers-Briggs, you have DISC, you have Strength Finders. I mean, I saw a book called like Strength Finders for Parents and Strength Finder. You could almost even put like the 5 love languages in that category. I mean, it's everywhere. So, how does this compare to some of the other tests? Maybe specifically Myers-Briggs, because that's sort of had a monopoly on the market until maybe like 2000 or so. So compared to Myers-Briggs, Strengths Finders, and DISC, those are maybe the three most prominent.
Okay. Compared to Myers-Briggs is interesting because it was considered, highly scientific for years until a journalist came out with what's a book called, I would advise anyone to read. It's called Personality Broker. And it showed the inside.
Dawson, let me interrupt you real quick. You would advise or wouldn't advise them to read?
I would advise.
It is a good book.
It's a really good book because it really shows the kind of inside game that a lot of these personality test things play to show they're valid without being valid. And this person really exposed the Myers-Briggs. Now, is the Myers-Briggs still good? Yeah, for some things, but I don't hold it highly because after reading that book, I was just like, wow, there's no science behind it. Probably the DISC test in terms of just general motivation. But with any understanding of a personality test, I feel like a lot of people forget or they assume more or less that psychologists have nailed down what personality is. They haven't at all. There's over 6 or 7 major theories of personality, and 3 of them, actually all but like one category, the trait theorists are the ones who come up with personality tests. The other ones have very few descriptions of what personality can be other than how to deal with it. So we're dealing with something that in psychology, everybody's like, hey, we really don't know as much as you think we do. And it's because in business schools and in churches and all these different people who get trained in these different personality tests, then want to make some money. And because they want to make some money, they work really hard to prove that it's a very scientific. So oftentimes, one part because it's helpful, and the other part because it makes them money.
So, okay, there are churches that won't hire people because they don't fit a Myers-Briggs profile. There are churches who will not support a church planter because they don't rate well on the DISC test. I know I'm going to divert from Enneagram for 10 seconds, but Dawson, could you please punch a hole in this kind of like pop psychology thing that we're like using to drive these megalodons of church movements?
We're going to hit every variation of that word. We got Megatron, Megalodon, Metaton. A Metaton? Okay, go ahead, Megaton. Dawson. So okay. Do people that we bring on staff or train as church planters, do they need to be informed with lore rooted in Metatron's angelic wisdom?
Okay, let me put it this way. There is one test that's been scientifically proven to be very consistent to actually meet the concerns of internal consistency, test result reliability, convergence validation, as well as predictive validation, like that meets those categories. And those are very stringent psychological statistical categories. And that's the Big Five. The Big Five is pretty consistent and pretty good at actually getting at a person's basic makeup, the thing that's not going to change over time. Outside of that test, all the other tests have varying levels of accuracy. And when people come in thinking that they can just, I don't have to, and this is, okay, I'm just going to say it. This is because pastors don't like to be pastors anymore. They like to give up actually taking the time to know people for a test that can then square things away so they can get back to do the things they want to do, like get on the golf course. So at the end of the day, they don't want to pastor and they don't want to do the hard work of getting to know people. Now, is it good? Are there good things with personality tests? There are a lot of decent ones and there's some really good ones. And the really good ones, like the Big Five, people should take it. And I think it's good for churches to even have their staff take it because it can help with conflict between people. It can help with a general understanding, but it doesn't define that person, and it doesn't make that person as if God can't do a work in them that can change that personality. I mean, you talk to anybody before I was a Christian, I was a brash, overbearing person. And then, now I'm meek and mild. But either way, the point is that God can work in someone's life and change them. And oftentimes, we need to always keep these things with a grain of salt on the bigger picture of just personality tests. They're not definitive of people. And it's bad.
He's meek and mild until you get him talking about the Christian industrial complex. Don't let him fool you guys. He drops the hammer once you start talking about,
you said
the church complex. Yeah. Anyway, Roundtree, you got a question?
Yeah. Well, Dawson, because I want to speak on behalf of some of the people who are watching that they would swear by the Enneagram, and they say the Enneagram read my mail. The Enneagram has changed my life. The Enneagram helps me know how to relate to others. It shows me what my strengths are. It shows me what my weaknesses are. Man, if I didn't know that I was like a 7-wing whatever, I wouldn't have been able to accomplish this thing. I mean, people swear by the Enneagram. So how can you claim that there is no science behind this? What's actually happening?
Okay. Let me just say this. There was a study that was done back in 2005 where they took about 100 doctoral level mental health experts, and they asked them, hey, rate for us the worst and most discredited personality tests to the ones that are most helpful. And the list that they got back had the Enneagram out of 89. People listed 89 of them. Out of 89, it was 88. It was the second worst of all personality tests by these experts. And not just that, the one that was worse, well, they're asking them what has been working for you. And these are doctoral level mental health experts. So they said, the one that doesn't work is the Rorschach test. That's just an ink blot test. What was the next one? The next one's the Enneagram. But what was the one that actually beat out the Enneagram? Well, that's called the Ichazo personality test, which is basically this personality test that you see 6 or 7 faces of people, and you pick out 4 faces that you like. And those 4 faces were, because all the pictures of people are people who actually have mental health issues. So then they take those 4 pictures, and the idea is that we have an innate ability to respond to people who are like us. So those photos that we like, that's going to tell you about your personality. So basically, experts in psychology were like, yeah, that the swipe right on the crazy person test, that's better than the Enneagram. So on terms of an expert level, that's something that it's just evident that it's not good. Now on a practical level. Now, on a practical level, why is it working? Well, there's a few reasons. The whole setup of it in terms of finding your true self and exposing your false self, which is the root of the whole spiritual growth component. First of all, that's got some crazy Trojan horse ideas within it. You could easily go down the road of both to a kind of a therapeutic gospel on one end, and the other end you could go down a New Age path. So it's very poor language that is used by a lot of the guys who write these books. But why does it work? Because that whole setup that I just described with it exposes your false self and it helps you find who you really are. Okay, in humanistic psychology, the way they deal with personality is they'll ask you questions. Say you go to a counseling psychologist who does a humanistic perspective, and he's going to ask you questions that kind of expose what you think your ideal self is. And then they're going to also ask you questions that help you see how you actually act, your actual self. And then through counseling, try to get you to where you move from your actual self to living out that ideal self. Okay. Now, if you come to a personality test that tells you who your ideal self is and you believe it, and then tells you how to get from this false self that you are to the true self, what you'll see is you'll have a cathartic experience because you've already had the buy-in that you believe that this is going to happen, that this will produce something good for you. And because of that false assurance, that misuse of kind of belief and faith, you experience a catharsis, just like in humanistic counseling, where your self-esteem is raised, because that's the whole point in the humanistic, in that form of counseling, is when a person's living out of their authentic self, they experience greater levels of self-esteem, greater levels of confidence, and what is described as spiritual growth in these circles. That same thing. Oh, I feel like I'm really being who I'm meant to be. So it's a way of using dynamics that are natural to the human psyche, but making it contingent on the Enneagram when it's not really the Enneagram. It's just you feeling like you're really living out who you are. Now, when you talk about the actual personality types, there's an aspect of it that is just untrue in that you've got the Barna effect going on. And the Barna effect is basically this idea that, okay, let me just say this. If you have, like, if someone says something like, at times I'm an extrovert, I'm friendly, I'm sociable, but there are times when I'm an introvert and I'm weary and reserved. Everybody is going to say, I felt like that before. Why? Because that is extremely general. I just described the whole spectrum. And while it's never put in those terms, it's put in such general terms that if you kind of look at any one of those, I mean, there are all times that a person has felt like a perfectionist. There's times where people have felt like a helper. And you can find yourself in one of those types very easily. I put a link.
You're going to link what?
I put a link in the study guide to a YouTube video from, I think 2020 did a couple of years ago with astrological charts that really makes this point very clear about the Barna effect is this idea that you have a tendency to take a generalized personal statement and make it specific to you individually. Like, oh, that really describes me. The problem is when you tell people that, they're like, are you insulting my intelligence and saying I'm that naive? No one said that to anybody, because this is something we all do at different times. But when you couple that with the fact that there has been scientific evidence that this is something that is extremely ripe in the Enneagram, it makes it an invalid personality type, period.
Now this is a secular psychological tool, the Enneagram, that's being used. Someone even go as far to say not just secular being neutral, but like demonic, right? So, and we would affirm that those origins are there, but even where it is today, even if it's not demonic, it's just not helpful scientifically. Now, I want to ask you about the Roman Catholics, not because I believe their discernment is so amazing, but because it seems to have affected them before vast evangelicalism. Like, it seems to be making its way through evangelicalism in this kind of pop psychology space, but it hit Roman Catholics first. So, I framed it before the show. It's like, hey, these guys pray to dead saints, they borderline worship Mary. And if they can tell that this thing is out of bounds, and certainly we can. That's not why we're asking about the Roman Catholics. We're asking about the Roman Catholics because it hit them before it hit evangelicalism. So what was their general take on the Enneagram?
Okay. Let me back that up a little bit and explain a little bit of the history, because this will put that in context. After Naranjo brought it to the U.S., it kind of went to two streams. About 78, 79, some Jesuit priests picked it up and began to use it in the seminaries in Chicago, I think is one of the main places. But it wasn't talked about like they did not write books on it. They handed their papers down to the next guy who was the spiritual director. And for years they did this. And I think one of the reasons is because as long as you don't leave a paper trail and you don't write books, the bishop can't get onto you. So they're doing this because they understand that this is coming from a very sketch place in terms of just a secularized tool that we're using for spiritual purposes with extremely very little messing with it and trying to integrate it. In the study guide, I pretty much show a parallel of how it's from the 77 use of it to the 2017. There's hardly any change. So to move forward, so you have years and years through the 80s that this thing's being used secretly in seminaries. And people are kind of like, I like it, I don't, et cetera, et cetera. But then in the same time during the 80s, you had the New Age movement picking it up. Helen Palmer, who is a psychic and just trying to rebrand herself, for years as the personality person, because there's money to be had among lectures and other retreats and such. They began to write books on it. And when they began to write books on it about the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, Richard Rohr said, well, heck, I'm going to write a book on it. He was at the time in the Catholic movement. He was trained in a Jesuit seminary. So he picks it up as well. And he writes a book on it and says he does an integration of it. This is the Christian's perspective of it. And that is at the beginning of the 90s. Right around that time, Pope John Paul, for whatever you think about him, one thing is true. He was pretty smart when it came to seeing cultural trends that were affecting people. And he wrote a work on denying and showing how the New Age movement was very much a part of that, and actually talked about Enneagram in that regard. Fast forward 10 years, the American Dionysius of Council for Doctrine basically came out and made a direct statement against the Enneagram, saying this is not a healthy thing to do. And then by 2003, the Vatican actually lays out a statement saying, hey, this is a New Age practice. We don't want the church doing it. It is not good for the church to be doing it. So they basically lay into that. And here's actually what they said the Vatican says in 2003. When used as a means of spiritual growth, it introduces an ambiguity to the doctrine and life of the Christian faith. And that ambiguity can lead you either to therapeutic gospel or it can lead you down the road to New Age, was the point they were making. So they basically said it is not good. It creates ambiguity.
Well, so Dawson, on that, there's that little preface to their statement, like when it's used for like spiritual purposes or something like that. There's somebody in the chat, Josh Gillens, he's asked several times. He says, hey, if I want to use it, even though it's not scientific, is it still demonic? Is it still going to, is this going to demonize me? Is this a sin for me? Because what if he doesn't want to use it in a spiritual way? What if he just wants to see what his number is? Are you suggesting that if somebody takes an Enneagram test, they need to receive deliverance ministry and get the demons cast out? Like, where is this going?
I would say, no. I would say it's not going to make you, it's not going to demonize you. But is it dangerous in the respects of being a Trojan horse that can lead you down false doctrine? Yes. Even just reading through it, the assumptions of the categories that it can help uncover and expose what the Bible only says the Holy Spirit's supposed to be doing. Well, the Holy Spirit could use it. Okay, sure. That could be a comeback. But at the end of the day, if you want to just take the test and see what your number is, and you're not like putting much weight in it, that's great. Problem is, I would advise anyone who does that not to put much weight in it, because you'll find that if it's not a helpful test and it doesn't have much scientific bearing, then, it's about as good as a BuzzFeed test.
Let me frame it like, and I want to know if you get pushback on this, right? So like with yoga, that was kind of the way that Josh kind of prefaced this question. We would say, don't practice yoga. Why? Because it's a dance that's retelling a Hindu story of a god beheading another god. It's like it's a dance. It's worship is what it is. There's no way to redeem it, right? Now, that's not to say that certain motions demons have patents on. Go do Pilates, but don't do those stretches in those patterns in those ways. Don't go sit under a yogi. Go stretch. It's okay. Go do some other form of calisthenics, right? Because there is demonic origins. There is demonic worship that's involved, inherent, intrinsic within it. Now with the Enneagram, we go, hey, it did have demonic origins. Can you be possessed? I don't know, but I certainly don't want to be practicing something that claims that it came from a demon. And then additionally, there's no scientific evidence to do it. So you can't even make the yoga, connection, because you can kind of make the argument that there is a calisthenics benefit to moving your body in certain ways. But there is zero benefit to practicing the Enneagram. There's just no reason any Christian in their right mind should want to practice a thing that they know willingly came probably from some kind of demonic experience, and then additionally cannot provide any benefit to the human life whatsoever. Would you agree with that? You could get possessed, maybe, but it's also not helpful, so you shouldn't do it anyway.
Oh yeah, I would definitely agree with that wholeheartedly. It's one of those sticky things because you got a lot of different things going on. I mean, there's tons of propaganda in terms of just doing research for this. So I was looking up online and I was reading this one little article that was like 5 best personality tests. Enneagram was not in that list, but every single thing I read in terms of the commercials, the little things on the side of your computer, and they were all Enneagrams. Click here for your Enneagram number. And I'm like, that is some seriously good publicity right there. Because they don't, even just in the advertising, it's trying to connect itself with the best of the best, if you will. And because of that makes it confusing as well, because when it comes to a personality test, especially a lot of these that are very general, it's how much faith you put into them that is the issue. I mean, okay. I know people who put a lot of faith into just the personality test aspect, and they think it really has defined them. They think it really understands them, and it might even give them some insight on in a general way. But at the end of the day, even if it gave you a little insight, every bit of the insight I've ever read in these books are common sense, basic pastoral insights you could get. If you struggle with perfectionism, what is your greatest fear going to be? Feeling bad that you did something wrong? Oh yeah, there you go, greatest fear. So it's very common sense type things that you could figure out on your own anyway. Yeah.
So I want to get you back on your train of thought. We asked you about Roman Catholicism. You made a statement about like this council of bishops that got together. You read that quotation, and then we kind of diverted off of that when used, for spiritual health and spiritual growth, those kinds of things. Is there any further, condemnation from the Roman Catholic Church on the Enneagram other than that?
Well, they pretty much shut it down in 2003. Like that was when the Vatican speaks on something. That's the end of it, or at least a lot of, in America, tons of priests will tell you, oh yeah, we still do it, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But at that point, on an official level, this is outside the bounds of what is considered something you should practice as the Christian faith. So from that point, generally speaking, all the, like Richard Rohr and all these other guys pivoted. And in their pivot, they started looking towards
abandoned
Protestant
Christianity
liberalism.
Altogether.
Huh?
I said abandoned Christianity altogether.
Well, he did that about 5 years,
probably
10 years
before that,
earlier.
Yeah.
He just didn't tell anybody. So, but it was around 2009 where he became popular, especially among the extreme branches of like the emergent church and the Protestant groups, and he started to see a market. So that was when, and if I can jump on my other hobby horse of the lack of discernment among publishers, they saw a marketing opportunity. This guy's getting popular. He's got a ton of disciples. They've written stuff. Why don't we publish what his disciples have written on the Enneagram? And that's where you get the Road Back to You and the Sacred Enneagram. All these guys are roar disciples, which, I mean, y'all have done stuff for, his theology is a mix of liberal Christian thinking with New Age twists and a lot of marshmallow fluff.
We've done
so some doctrine of demons and some doctrine straight from Satan is the kind of culmination that we have.
Yeah, definitely. That'd be a good way of putting it. So here's this guy who's definitely not anywhere central in terms of orthodoxy, who is teaching how to spiritually grow, and he's teaching a pattern of spiritual growth that then is produced into books that is sold at mass as authentic Christianity to the whole of Protestantism through InterVarsity Press, Zondervan. He's on Christianity Today. One of the authors of Road Back to You is on Christianity Today talking about how the Enneagram was, comes from the Desert Fathers. That's a bunch of baloney. But anyway, sorry. It just annoys me how naive people think we are at times.
Yeah.
But
I want to, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I'm just kind of thinking, one of the things that you said was you can take it, just don't put too much weight in it. And I want to press into that just a little bit more, because if it really does have demonic origins, if it is very New Age in its sourcing, I'm just thinking about this. Like, couldn't we say the same, like, take Myers-Briggs, which I don't think people are saying is demonic, or StrengthsFinder. I don't think people are saying that's demonic. We could kind of say don't put too much weight on a personality test no matter what, right? I think the way we get to know ourselves is by getting to know God, who knows us better than ourselves. I think of Proverbs 20, where it says, the purposes of a man's heart are deep waters. That is, it's cloudy. We don't even know ourselves, but a man of understanding draws them out. Well, who's the man of understanding? It's the one that fears God. So in knowing God, we get to know ourselves. So, personality tests generally, don't just take them fine, but don't put too much stock in them. That's always been my attitude. And so we're saying the same thing about Enneagram, but Enneagram does seem to be in a different category. It is not just a personality test. It's a personality test created by somebody who said an angel, we'll call it a demon, appeared to me and gave me this and dictated it to me. And I wrote it out, and I was tripping out on drugs. I mean, that's a little different than Myers-Briggs and StrengthsFinder. So should there be an extra level of caution with this test?
I would say what you just described is what I was trying to get at the beginning. It's definitely something that we should not, because of its origins. But here's the thing: when you lean too heavily on origins, you can commit the genetic fallacy. But I don't think that's what's going on here, because there's a tendency. Like, I'm not sure if I know. I'm not sure if he did that, or if that was just his interpretation of some drug-induced dream. Either way, is it a bad test on its own merit? Yes. So just in that, it should be put in its own category. Does it have a tendency to lead to bad doctrine if you really commit to following the spiritual growth aspect? Yes, it does. So should pastors promote it? No, they shouldn't, because of that. I think on church level, we should say no, that this is not a good practice. This is not a good just personality test to even do. So I would agree with you on that regard.
So I hear you saying that you're not confident that it's demonic, and because you're not confident that it's demonic, you're not confident that it can demonize someone. But still, I mean, it's like, talking about eating poorly, like, should you eat McDonald's? Like, I'm not going to get on here. It's probably worse than that. But like, you can make a blanket statement like, this isn't good for you. You shouldn't do this. And I think you can make that statement about the Enneagram. It's got no net benefit. If anything, it's going to waste your time. And for that reason and that reason alone, you shouldn't do it. Now, I'd be willing to go further and say, because of its demonic origins, it creates a greater pause. It creates a greater sense of, I don't want to go there. I don't want to play with that. And I think I hear that same kind of hesitation in you. You're not willing to say, and I think the reason you said you could take it, when I heard you say that, it was in response to Michael asking, will you get demonized if you take this? It seemed like you were not willing to say you will for sure get a prepackaged demon if you go to enneagram.org and take the test. I think that's what he was responding to.
It's the word prepackaged in there that's key.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Demons Are Us. It gets Amazon shipped to you next day delivery.
That's exactly the truth right there. What you just said just pretty much describes it for me. I don't want to say that it's going to demonize you if you take it, but also it's in no way, shape, or form, whether scientifically, theologically, or in its origins, something that you want to be dealing with. And the fact that even the new version is extremely close in resemblance to the original back in the 70s, and it was taught and is taught by the disciples of someone who has very unorthodox, a guy who was a Catholic, and when this thing came out, he shifted to Protestants, should show he's just trying to find an audience and is not someone to be listened to, no matter how well he writes. But all those things should kind of be a preponderance of evidence that this is not something you should want to be a part of. Should you do like strength finders? Yeah, that's a great one. I wish more people would get trained in the Big Five, because that's one of the few that actually has scientific validation to it. And that's the really big thing is back in the 90s and 2000s, everybody got their Myers-Briggs, certification. That's why it's become so popular, because once they got their certification, everybody was pushing the Myers-Briggs.
So,
but go read that book.
Dawson, we've talked about the Roman Catholics a little bit. Can you tell us, like, how are the evangelicals handling the Enneagram? And you mentioned it a little bit, popularizing it. How is the evangelical community grappling with it right now? I mean, I think people have heard me kind of take a dump on this idea that, tons of churches, especially the big ones, it seems as if it's an organizational trend in the West. If you have an organization that has a bunch of people in it, that taking these kinds of tests is a helpful tool. And, if everyone's saying it, it seems to be true, right? So people are just kind of jumping on it without doing any research, any investigation. What is the evangelical community as an organization? I hate to say it that way, but what are they doing as a whole when it comes to the Enneagram?
Do we have that quote from the Sacred Enneagram? We have
from Christopher.
From Christopher, yeah, because that sums up the approach that's being taken towards the evangelical movement and how it's being packaged. Yeah,
Naranjo, you want to read it?
This is Christopher. I don't know how you say his last name because this is way too many vowels together. Heuertz. Christopher Heuertz says this in the Sacred Enneagram, written in 2017. The Enneagram is much more than just another popular formula to pair people to the collection of their personality foibles and eccentricities. It explains the why of how we think, act, and feel. It also has come to terms with our gifts as well as the addictive patterns that tether us to our greatest interpersonal, spiritual, and emotional challenges. The Enneagram invites us to deeper self-awareness as a doorway to spiritual growth. Oh, gosh, sorry. I almost threw up in my mouth. Enneagram offers a sacred map for our souls a map that, when understood, leads us home to our true identity and to God. Ew, this is terrible. Yeah. Dawson.
Yeah.
This is terrible.
Now you see what I'm talking about. All you got to do is
this
read
is
one of these guys'
endangering
books.
And so much mess. I feel like, Josh, so many shows we're coming back to the same thing, and that is the endangering of the sufficiency of Scripture. That is that the Scriptures give us everything we need for life and godliness. So anytime somebody comes with a newfangled tool that is able to help you understand God and yourself and humanity in ways that the Scripture was designed to do, but this new tool that Paul never had, that Jesus never had, is going to take you further. Why do I need a spiritual tool that Jesus himself did not have when he walked the earth? Why do I need a spiritual tool that the Apostle Paul and Peter and the 12 didn't have when they walked the face of the earth? I mean, God gave us everything that we need in the Scripture for life and godliness. I don't need the Enneagram to be holy. It has nothing to do with that. This is a terrible quote. I hate this quote. Now, to be fair,
that's kind of
it's a quote, and I could imagine maybe there's a broader context that helps it some, but man, there are some quotes where you kind of don't even need a context, right? Like, I think that's one of them. So that's my take. Sorry, I was gonna toss that quote over to you, Dawson, for a response, but I had to explain the vomit in my mouth. Sorry.
Yeah, it's not the best at all. I mean, when it says that it actually gives you your true identity and leads you home to God, I thought Jesus did that.
But I think part of your reason for including the quote in the research is this is reflective of what much evangelical thinking is on the Enneagram. So when you talk about don't put too much weight into it, there's a prime example.
Yeah, exactly. And that, like I said in the beginning, there's that static way of using it and there's a dynamic way. And every book that is written on the Enneagram for evangelicals focuses in on that dynamic spiritual growth, lead you back to God, show you your true identity aspect. So if anyone's going to read the book, going to because even if you take the time to just read 200, 300 pages of a book, you're investing enough that it has the potential to shift you even just a little, honestly, probably more towards a therapeutic view of sin and a therapeutic view of the gospel.
Could you unpack that actually? What do you mean by a therapeutic view of sin in the gospel?
Okay. Oftentimes, when people who work in psychology try to integrate their Christian faith and psychology, which is possible, but oftentimes when people do it, you have people who have a high school degree in theology and a PhD in psychology, and their integration is wrong because they just know more psychology and don't even know any theology. When if you're going to do any kind of integration, you're going to have to be you're going to have to be, and I don't mean literally a PhD, but you're going to have to know your theology inside and out and have a much lighter understanding of psychology to do any proper integration. Because that's been done so poorly over the years, things like sin begins to be talked about in a therapeutic way in terms of sin is our dysfunction, not our lawlessness and rebellion before God. It gets discussed in terms of a therapeutic kind of a way of outlining it. In the handout, I give some examples, some quote examples of this, of that therapeutic language where you have no talk of atonement.
I see the question.
No talk of these other things. Yeah.
I'm with you. I think Michael, Josh's follow-up question on should I go to a church that practices the Enneagram. And I also see a couple people naming churches that are like, hey, Bethel uses Enneagram or this church or that. The larger the church, I would probably assume that they're going to try to implement the Enneagram because larger organizations are thinking about how is this personality type going to integrate with that personality type.
More likely.
It's more likely because it's, again, pop culture, psychology. And can we also just assume, guys, that could there be massive churches, me and Dawson kind of riffed off of a little bit, getting angry that people are using psychological tests to qualify people for pastorates or qualify people for church planting. Can we agree that it's going to require an individual who doesn't shut down quickly to plant a church? Yes. I think all of us are going to agree.
You need grit.
Yeah, you don't need an Enneagram to prove that, but is there a personality type, a person who isn't going to take no for an answer and they're going to keep going? Like the second that their feelings hurt, they're not going to shut down and like fall apart. That has probably more to do with like internal health than it does a personality type necessarily. But there's going to be a lot of failures, a lot of setbacks in planting a church. It's going to be difficult. And you got to have some grit. Yeah, sure. So people are trying to find ways to vet people. They're trying to use the tools that are at their disposal. So I think we need to have this conversation with an ounce of grace when it comes to these things. There is certainly some frustrations that we have, but we don't want to inflate those frustrations into something, because that church is using it, they're demonic, they got demons leading their church, they're crawling out their windows, hide your kids, hide your wife. That's not exactly the way that we should handle the situation. I think what you should do is start a conversation. I think lots of churches are doing things that they don't realize where this came from, the sociological effects it's having on the community. So start a conversation with your leadership. I say, hey, I've done a bit of research on this Enneagram. Here's this really great study guide written by a mastermind named Dawson that I pulled off of this website. Please. And share a document with them. Send them a YouTube video. Send them this. Share stuff. Have conversations. Begin to I think initiate some of those things, and you kind of test these things out. Use wisdom. Use discernment. I don't think because of how this is promoted just in the secular world as a neutral tool that most pastors, hey, Roundtree, did you know that this were the origins of the Enneagram?
Am I aware of the origins of the Enneagram?
Well, I mean, you are now, but before this conversation, before someone said, hey, we should do the Enneagram, did you know the origins of it?
I had just heard rumors. I had never done research on it myself. So I've never been too into personality tests.
I didn't know what it was. And I think the vast majority of pastors don't know what the Enneagram, either what it is or where it came from.
They're using it innocently is what you're saying.
That's what I'm trying to say.
They're not going in saying they're not going into it saying Metatron the Archangel appeared to somebody and gave him the Enneagram. Ooh, I'm going to give it to my congregation. It's not happening that way. They just hear about a cool test and then they take it and they give it to their people. And so that's actually what we're trying to do with this episode is to educate people. But Dawson, I want to come back to something and a phrase that you used earlier, and I think Josh used it too, is the genetic fallacy. And that is that because something started a certain way, and that way is bad, therefore I shouldn't do it. So like in this case, some would argue that this is a genetic fallacy. Well, hey, just because it started off on the wrong foot in its genesis, that doesn't mean that it's a bad thing today. It's gone through changes and iterations, and Enneagram in its present form is nothing like it was in its inception, at its genesis. So we really shouldn't equate the two. It's an innocent personality test. What would you say to the person who objects to the things you're saying with that argument?
That's a moot point, because if you take the Enneagram on the merits of itself, not taking it on the genetic fallacy, but you take it on its own merits, you look at it within a scientific context, you come to find out it is a very, very poor judge of someone's personality. And just understand that that's taking it. That makes any kind of talk about genetic fallacy a moot point, because it doesn't hold up to scrutiny on its own merit. So that's how I'd answer that. But at the end of the day, my concern, because I've seen this, is when someone, especially in a church context, begins to use, or even a husband and wife context. I have a friend whose wife was into this big, and she ended up holding resentment against her husband because he wasn't this number instead of that number, and he wouldn't work at becoming that number, and that's what she needed, and she divorced him. Or think about this idea where someone takes the test and this week they score as a 6, and all the things that it says are the temptations and the spiritual besetting sins and problems of that number 6. The pastor begins to talk to you like, you're the person who scored a 6, and begins to talk to you like you've done those things, and none of those things are your problems, but you're being treated as if it is. This is how that kind of typology can be very problematic in the church. And that's one of my concerns with it.
I got him again. No, I'm just kidding. I'd like to do that. Michael asked a question. Let's land this plane, guys. So at the end of the day, someone, they're just asking questions of clarification. If you are convinced that this thing is being practiced in a sinful way, and you're at a church that's practicing this thing, I think you Matthew 18 it, right? So you confront. If they don't listen, you bring someone else with you, and you confront again, and then you just have nothing to do with them. You handle it in a church discipline scenario. I don't think that this isn't as blatant. So when it comes to these issues, guys, I think that you have to handle these issues with the level of clarity that the scriptures do, right? If this is adultery, this is clearly bad. This is clearly evil. This is clearly demonic. I don't think that you get to show up in a church and then all of a sudden make a claim. They don't know who you are. They don't have a relationship with you. And then suddenly like write off the church as like demonic. Because the vibe I'm getting from the keyboard warriors in the comment section is that they want to burn these churches to the ground that practice the Enneagram. I think it's wrong. I think I would confront them. I think if they were completely numb to confrontation, I would bring other people with me, Matthew 18. I'd probably stop going to a church altogether. If they were encouraging, practicing, it was part of the culture of the church, I wouldn't be interested, especially if I'd brought it to the awareness of multiple people on the team, on the staff. I probably wouldn't be interested in that. But I also really hope that you guys are taking this with a spirit of charity and with grace, because there are people who are ignorant, and there are people who hear every single time they come into church, oh, we're doing this wrong. Oh, we're doing that wrong. Oh, we're doing this wrong. And it just seems to be harmless to them. And they're not taking Enneagram dangerous the way that they are sexual immorality and all the gender issues that we're dealing with right now in the church. It's just not as pressing. I hope that you give your leadership grace on things that are ambiguous. If they did some research, if they did a quick Google search, they would find conflicting data. The reason I didn't solo this show with me, Michael, and Michael was because I didn't trust the amount of research, because you can find research that points in different directions on the internet. It's not a monolith of data. I believe what we've presented today is true. And it's the reason we tasked Dawson with researching it, is because there's conflicting stuff out there. So I hope that you can treat your pastors with respect and honor and grace with something as seemingly innocent as the Enneagram. And I don't think it is innocent. I just give them grace.
Right. And Josh, I think I would say, I mean, you pulled in Matthew 18, which is a church discipline passage. Now, let me say, if somebody was astral projecting, consulting spirits, talking to the dead, those kinds of things, that's a for sure church discipline thing in my mind. Because I see church discipline as a clear and obvious and significant sin issue. I don't think that you church discipline over things that are ambiguous or people are going to disagree about the research. Let's say that somebody's not ignorant. Let's say they've done just loads of research on this, and they come to the opinion that they say, you know what, they tag it with the genetic fallacy. They say, well, it started this way, but it's not that way anymore. This is a simple personality test. I don't think that this is divination. I think that there are miles of difference between taking an Enneagram test online and channeling a spirit or astral projecting, and so on. Now, I'm going to disagree with them because I agree with the premise of the show. I'm going to say, stay away from Enneagram. I think it's bad. I think it has demonic origins. I think it's tied to a new age. I think all the things that we've been saying, but I'm not, if somebody in my church is like, I just like the Enneagram. I'm not going to be like, get out, you sinner. I'm going to warn them. I'm going to say, hey, I think this is dangerous. That's me. But I think we need to be careful about the church discipline thing, to where if something isn't clear and obvious sin, I think that we need to be careful about it. I know some of you in the chat aren't going to like that, but that's going to be
But
my
so the
position.
question was more on like personal, like, Michael, would you attend a church that was practicing promoting the Enneagram personally, especially after bringing up concerns?
It's a funny question, since I pastor a church, so I just wouldn't do the Enneagram in my church.
Well, but you know what I
to
mean?
put myself in those shoes, yeah, I can do that. I think probably not. I think what I would say is, it's a nuanced and difficult question, because what if there are 1 million things I love about this church? What if I live in rural Ohio and it's the only decent gospel preaching church around?
That's
and
right.
Be like, it took an Enneagram test, I'm out. I think that it's possible to be so critical of all churches you can never get involved in one. I think I would just simply say, I talk to the leadership about it, express your concern about it. And whether or not you go to that church, there are just too many factors to consider. If your church is astral projecting, don't go to that church, because it's not a gospel preaching church. Yes. Dawson, what were you going to say?
Yeah, let me just on the tail end of say this. The reason there's good reason why a lot of pastors and a lot of people pick up the Enneagram and go, wow, I need to use this with my church, or I need to use this in some context. It's one of the few works that does a lot with, even though it, in my understanding, perverts it, it puts things in a spiritual context. Whereas for years and years and years, those things were not put in a spiritual context. So you couldn't, a type is going to also have, like, what someone's besetting sins are, and advice for them to grow closer to God. So for a pastor who might not be trained in psychology, to have something that kind of gives some advice that's kind of right there in bullet points for them to talk to that person with, that's a game changer in terms of counseling theory and counseling work. So I understand the pragmatic reason why so many do it and use it. Problem is, all the psychologists out there that are listening to this, write some good books. Use the Big Five as your baseline. Give good advice. They're so needed, because when you don't have good food, people eat stuff like this. So I want to put it on the people who aren't stepping up to the plate and giving nourishment to the church.
Yeah, I just agree with, I think Michael framed that in a really helpful way, because I think if you live in a big city area and you're picking churches, you've got a church on every corner. If you're living in some rural community and you have the choice between, an Orthodox Christian church that's really sound biblical teaching, and they loosely have Enneagram tests or use them on some way, you've got that, or the apostate liberal church that is ordaining homosexuals. It's an easy choice. So framing it in that way, I think, is really helpful. I mean, or you plant your own, right? So it's one of those things that I think that we have to engage this with wisdom. But yeah, universally across the board, we all say bad. And anyone have any closing thoughts before we wrap this up? Because we definitely need to land this plane, fellas. Anybody?
Yeah. I think we need to land the plane. I think I would simply say, warn against it. I don't think it's great. Let's just focus on God's word and stop being distracted by this kind of thing. Take a different personality test like the Big Five. It's better scientifically and not worth the spiritual baggage that comes with the Enneagram.
Dawson, thanks so much for joining the program today. I'm putting your study guide in the show notes, but like you guys, TheRemnantRadio.com, there's a tab that says study guides, and all of our study guides are there. And when I say our study guides, I mean the ones that Dawson wrote for Remnant Radio, right? Okay, so I don't want to take any credit for writing any of those. Dawson's done all of that research for us. He does a really, really great job. It's very, very thorough. So all the stuff is actually noted as well. So if he makes a claim about something, there is a note where it goes, if you read the one on the Enneagram, it's pretty funny. There's a couple moments that are going to get you laughing. So blessings, guys. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Remnant Radio. If you want to support the channel, we're entirely crowdfunded. So there's links in the description. You can give a one-time gift on PayPal or be a reoccurring giver there on Patreon. You get access to extra content on Patreon. So I encourage you to give there. And we will see you next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. Central Standard Time. Blessings.